Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to the discussion on racial justice. This is a critical and important time to be discussing this. So I thought I would start off by talking about language, because not having the words to talk about complicated issues often allows us to bury them and not really talk about them at all. Let's think about most things in the United States. Most structures, from corporate org charts to voting rights, were designed by and for straight white men. And since that was who was in power, that really didn't need to change for very long. But then the demography of who was showing up for work and who are your customers couldn't be ignored any longer. And when this changing workforce first forced early diversity efforts inside corporations, human resources was largely tasked with handling this. And the result was a years-long effort on teaching tolerance. Now, I want you to think about that word and how such a benign-sounding bunch of letters, tolerance, can have such ugliness at its core. That people who were not the mainstream stereotype of white heterosexual men were going to be tolerated at work. And who wants to be tolerated? So while the language has changed for the better into diversity and more recently inclusion, and I'm sure nearly all of you have very robust diversity and inclusion efforts inside your own organizations, they're not really working. On average today, women still make around 77 cents on the dollar that men do for similar roles, and people of color are still woefully underrepresented in many parts of the economy and do not have equal access to either capital or healthcare, both of which we'll discuss during our panel. I think especially when it comes to race, we often stumble because we don't have the language to talk about it. For those of you on the call who are not African American, if when I say race, you hear Black, you're missing the fact of your own racial construct and how you might be tasking the very people subject to discrimination with both explaining it to you and devising the solution. Corporate America's response to many of these issues has been to form affinity groups of African Americans, of the Latinx community, of the LGBT plus community, etc. And I think those also have been far less effective than they might have been, because we're tasking these groups who already see and live these issues every day with solving a problem they did not create. Here's another word: racist. If you ask anyone, no one is a racist. And yet racism is everywhere. So because the word has been relegated to mean only overt acts of cruelty or meanness towards people of a different race, your tolerance of difference gives you a pass. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wrote a piece recently, which I thought was a great analogy. He said, racism is like dust. It's always in the air, but you only see it when the sun hits it a certain way. So I want to take this opportunity to address that dust, which is everywhere, and start inside your own corporations. We want to make this session a bit participative and engage you in thinking through the issue of race inside your own companies and your own perspectives. I'm not going to go into the introductions of all of the speakers because you have their bios already and I want to get straight into the subject matter. But Don, let's start with you. So real estate should be a fairly democratized business because everyone needs housing and there's fairly low barriers to entry. Talk about your own experience as a developer and what you've seen change over the decades that you've been in the business. And then if you would talk about how minorities and women developers are faring today in accessing the capital that they need.
It's a great opportunity to speak to Milken, always a positive and productive discussion. Real estate, as you pointed out, is a very democratized business because mainly there are low barriers to entry, very low educational barriers to entry into the industry, and it's very entrepreneurial. And so as a result, you can start off doing, be a taxi driver, be in many stores, or you can have worked as a real estate broker, an appraiser like me, and enter the development business. And that requires access, of course, to opportunities to learn the business and opportunities to gain capital access and development deal access and deal flow. And as a result of that, it's been ultimately it's an incestuous industry where you have generational wealth passed down, because unlike being a doctor, being a scientist, being an investment banker, being in finance, those professions you can't hand down generationally. You can basically, as a real estate property owner, for example, I can leave my office buildings and apartment buildings and hotels to my children and my grandchildren, and they don't have to have an aptitude to know this business. They can hire professionals to do it. And that's how generational real estate families transfer that industry and that business. And so if you look at a place like New York, a large amount of real estate is controlled by generational families. However, breaking into the business is still an entrepreneurial opportunity in an environment of great transformation. So you can have a situation where someone goes into the business from another industry. In fact, the person, Michael Stern, who's a super smart guy, is building the tallest building in New York City, residential building in New York City right now. And he started off about 15 years ago selling wigs from his living room. So low barriers to entry. However, what is surprising is that at the large scale of real estate development, you see essentially almost no African Americans. And I do business in 8 different cities. And we are always generally the largest Black-owned development business in that market when we enter it. And one of the reasons why is access to capital. And so, for example, when I started my business, I started in the real estate business in 1980, and then when interest rates were 22%. And then by 1983, started my own real estate appraisal and brokerage business. And by 1986, started my first office building. That building was a public-private partnership. It was an office building built for the city of Washington, D.C., designed to kickstart economic redevelopment in a neighborhood called Anacostia, very similar, say, to Watts in Los Angeles, which had been destroyed by the riots of 1968. However, the government there had an affirmative effort to empower Black-owned businesses, and at that time required that 35% of all the city's contracts be provided to Black business entrepreneurs and owners. And so as a result, I got access to a deal. And normally a good deal can be financed. Now, it's not as easy when it comes to minorities, but in that environment and time where there was an agenda to empower African-American entrepreneurs, we were able to get that deal financed. It was a 100,000 square foot office building. I still own it today, by the way, and we're renovating it as we speak. And that was the foundation to take our company to where we are today, which is we've got a $4 billion development pipeline. However, the biggest challenge throughout our career has been access to capital, access to equity capital. And that is the challenge that most African-American entrepreneurs across any business confront, is access to capital. I mean, if you look at, there's $70 trillion of capital in venture capital, private equity, and less than 1.3% of that money goes to minority and women asset managers and owners. So you have, and then at the same hand, you have Black women starting about 30% of all new small businesses in this country, and yet they're struggling to have access to capital. And so the biggest challenge in my industry has and continues to be access to capital and access to opportunities. That is why we see so few African-American entrepreneurs in my business in the real estate space.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. Let's turn to Deborah. Deborah, you've spent 24 years at CalSTRS, one of the largest funds in the country with over $240 billion under management. I know that inside CalSTRS, you actually produce annually a report on diversity, which I would recommend everyone on the call to look at because it's fully transparent, even when the numbers aren't great, but getting better. So I think you need to know where you're starting from in order to affect any change. Give us the perspective of minorities being underrepresented as far as managing some of the money at CalSTRS, right? They're not getting the allocations that other people might. And yet, I'm sure all of the pensioners and contributors are largely, a bigger percentage than those managing the money. Well, what is CalSTRS trying to do about that?
Sure. So thank you for being able to participate on this panel. CalSTRS has had a long history of implementing the principles of diversity and inclusion, both in our core values at CalSTRS as well as in active management. We are also looking at internal management. So CalSTRS takes a multifaceted approach to diversity across all of our asset classes within CalSTRS. In internal management, one of our objectives is to bring more assets in-house. And those are managed by our diverse team, both gender and ethnic diversity. About 50% of our assets are managed in-house. We have the Emerging Manager Program. We've had that program since 2004. We host a diversity program that brings emerging managers together. We host that with CalPERS every 2 years, so we have a reception. Most of our emerging manager program is women-owned or diversity-owned businesses. I think that what we need to do is widen that access to capital, look at our due diligence process, and find out what's not working and what's working.
Thank you. Let me turn to Byron. How is this moment different than prior moments, be it Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, or countless others? And how do we get something done before the speed of the news cycle takes it away and replaces it with this opportunity?
First of all, thank you for having me on the panel, and that's a great question. I think this moment is the culmination of a lot of moments. George Floyd wasn't just one. I think George Floyd, what that did is it made the world look at the ugliness of racism for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And it made a lot of people enraged, uncomfortable. I think it helped to create this moment. Also, I think COVID-19 and people being locked up, African Americans disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, and just the administration and what's going on in the air overall. Going all the way back to Charlottesville, when you have somebody living in the White House saying that they're good people on both sides, and you have a dead woman and neo-Nazis. What happens is people say enough's enough. We don't have good people on both sides. That's just wrong. That's blatant racism. And people are just fed up. And just to go to what Don was saying earlier, the DNA of everything that's happening here is when you just look at the relationship of African Americans and how it relates to America, you have to remember we're the one group that didn't come here on the Love Boat. We weren't the ones who chose to come here. We were kidnapped and we were brought here and we were enslaved and we were tortured and murdered. And we were forced to provide free labor for 250 years, approximately 250 years. The relationship of America and Black America was that we were brought here to create wealth in America, to make white America wealthy. And when we were brought here to be assets. At one point, it was more important to own slaves than to have real estate or land. And you were judged by your wealth by how many slaves you had. We were on the asset side of the balance sheet. But the moment we were freed, we became a liability. And that is the moment when they said, we're not going to compete against you for this great American economic pie. And what we're going to do is we're going to murder you. We're going to lynch you. We're going to incarcerate you. We're going to burn down your towns and blow them up when they show prosperity. We're going to shut you down, and we're going to segregate you, and we're going to commit genocide against you by making sure you don't have access to a proper education. You don't have access to capital that's not predatory. We're going to make sure that you have plenty of drugs, gangs, and alcohol in your community, because we don't want to compete with you because you were brought here to make me wealthy, not to make yourself wealthy. I'm not going to compete. I'm going to shut you down. And to Don's point, it's not only not access to capital, it's not access to any capital other than predatory capital. Now, I started my company from my dining room table 27 years ago, and I own my company 100%, not by design, but because no one ever offered me capital. I didn't have a bank loan for almost the first 20 years of my company. I had to use a factor. And my receivables were Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, some of the biggest corporations in the world. And I had to pay 27% interest on an annual basis to factor the greatest receivables ever. But because I couldn't handle the float of 90 to 120 days, I had to go and call the money in. Now, the most amazing thing about my company is that I survived years of factoring at 27%. And I probably billed over $500 million, over $500 million and not one penny went bad, not one penny. But I didn't have those doors open to me to invest. But that was the blessing and the curse. So the blessing was that you forced me to be stronger. You forced me to build it brick by brick. I'm the kid who had to go and bench press 500 pounds, and the other kid only had to bench press 50 pounds. And when things got a little rough, he went down like a paper napkin. But because I was forced to do things others weren't, I built a stronger foundation. And people say, well, now today you have over 1,300 employees, and you own the Weather Channel and 8 other networks, and you own ABC, CBS, and Fox affiliates across the country. All of that was based on the resistance that I got from white corporate America that would not lean in and support me properly the way I saw my white counterparts. And I wrote about that in my op-ed in conclusion called Black America Speaks. America should listen, what we need to do to never come back here again. It's 10 points. And I knew that white-owned media wouldn't publish it. And I did go to white-owned media and say, here's what I think we need to do to never come back here again. And I ended up spending almost $1 million of my own money to buy 16 full-page ads in 8 newspapers across the country. Because the one thing Martin Luther King taught us was that during the civil rights movement, he had plenty of white liberals who wanted to support on civil rights, but when it was time to talk about economic inclusion, all the white liberals disappeared, and that's when he said there are 2 Americas. 2 Americas won't survive, we need 1 America. And I knew that media, white-owned media, wouldn't write about what we needed to do in the way of economic inclusion, and that's why I bought those ads. And by the way, last but not least, this isn't, and my first point was, white America, do not donate money. Please don't donate money. We're not a charity, and you're not going to be able to donate your way out of this. This is an investment. You need to make an investment. And the other thing that I believe is important for white America to understand is you need to make this investment to protect yourselves, because we're not the issue, it's your foreign competitors. You have all the money. And as we lose to foreign competitors, you have the most to lose. And you need to make sure every American is fully engaged, every American is educated, and every American becomes an asset and not a liability, because we didn't prepare them for success and we didn't position them for success. White America has the most to lose by not making sure that every American is fully maximized for success long term. It's 1 American, it's 1 tribe, and we're not prepared as we go up against our international competitors.
A lot to unpack there, and hopefully we'll come back and get some of it. I think the notion that philanthropy is the way through this, you're totally correct, because the power dynamic of philanthropy goes back to what I was talking about language, is the recipient is supposed to feel eternally grateful as opposed to viewing it as an investment in leveling the playing field. The other thing that you and Don mentioned, I want to turn to Phil, because one thing that COVID-19 has ripped bare is the very disproportionate health outcomes of people of color. And you, Phil, kind of running Montefiore in the Bronx, which I would view as we were talking the other day, the epicenter of the epicenter. You had 2 times the death rate of New York, which was already the highest in the country from COVID, because people bring other health issues before COVID hit. And the white flight that occurred where your hospital system operates has left people. I know you mentioned that 85% of the patients you see are either Medicare or Medicaid recipients. Talk to us about, one, give us the sense of what that was like, given the flood of very sick COVID people that were coming into the hospital. And how did you, as a leader, manage through that, knowing that people of color were going to be disproportionately affected?
Thank you very much, Rich. And I think that Don and Deborah and Byron laid the framework and made some very compelling, accurate arguments about what we're facing here. The COVID-19 experience was an awful one. It hit us hard and fast, ravaged the city, filled the hospitals, declared itself loudly as an emergency, and shut down everything that we did. And so it was sort of I was telling somebody the other day, it was kind of being in a dystopian experience, utterly dystopian. You see, nobody sees anybody else's faces because everyone's wearing masks and shields and gowns and head coverings. And so you see people moving around for 18 hours a day, and you hear their voices, and you don't see anybody's faces for weeks and weeks and weeks. The patients are alone, massively ill patients, alone in a bed, also masked, on ventilators with no family members because nobody is allowed to visit. So, and even for a profession that's used to death and dying, there was just way too much death and dying. People saw more death and dying, and particularly brutal deaths in a 1 week time frame than you would see in years. And you're right. Our main hospital was in the hardest hit borough, in the hardest hit city, in the hardest hit state, in the hardest hit country in the world with COVID-19. What COVID-19 did was expose what was already an underlying disparity that had taken years to create. People often think that, people say to me sometimes, if Montefiore has been there this long, how come the Bronx still has such poor health population status? When you look at the Bronx, and I explain that healthcare services is only the fifth factor that determines health of a population. The first is genetics, which we can modify a little bit, but not much. But then after that, it's behavior, it's the physical environment, crowding, pollution, then it's the social environment, economic disparity, violence, racism, and only fifth is healthcare. So if you live in a crowded housing complex where you don't have access to good education, and where there's no outdoor space, and there's violence outside, so the kids can't go out and play, and there's no access to vegetables and fruits and healthy foods. And when those foods are there, by the way, we've done studies on these, the foods in the inner city settings, healthy food, cost more there than they cost in the affluent suburb. Just a little while ago, and in fact, we've asked grocers about why that's the case, and there are excuses around security that's needed and so on. So you have food deserts, and therefore junk food is more easily accessible. All of that leads to a higher rate of obesity and diabetes, just as one example. Why am I saying all this about this particular disease? Because we lost in the last 3 months. We looked after tens of thousands of sick patients with COVID in our outpatient setting, admitted 13,000 of the sickest of the sick, successfully treated and discharged more than 10,000 that should have otherwise died. Regrettably, 2,200 lost their lives and succumbed to the disease. Half of everyone who succumbed to COVID in Montefiore had diabetes as an underlying medical condition. So you see how a complex set of circumstances that are systemic created a disparity that then resulted in this outrageous difference in survival when a global pandemic came. So in fact, when I wrote about the two viruses in an op-ed in the New York Times, one novel COVID, the other endemic racism, and the connection between the two is because we saw it vividly at the time of the COVID pandemic. And so, Rich, the answer is that what COVID did was rip the bandage off of something that's been simmering there, and that is the product of many years of built-in systemic disparities that then produces the outcomes that you see. By the way, if you were Black or Latino and was treated at Montefiore with COVID, your survival rate was higher than those of whites treated elsewhere. So it's not the healthcare itself that's the disparity, although in some places it is. There's a background disparity that is baked in that creates outcomes that are much worse than elsewhere.
It's interesting. Let's think about how we start chipping this away and who takes responsibility for some of it and what are the assets and powers that we have at our disposal. So I want to go back to Deborah first for a moment. As I mentioned, CalSTRS has some $240 billion, probably, I don't know, 120, 140 of equities. As equity owners, you're the owner of the company. And I know that we have demonstrable evidence that more diverse boards and more diverse workplaces actually yield much better financial returns over time. What levers do you think you have at CalSTRS as owners of these companies by owning the equity portion to affect change inside the organizations in which you invest? Not only inside CalSTRS, because I think you've made diversity a key thing you're focused on, but inside the companies that you're investing in. What can you tell us a little about, like, how you view what levers of power to affect change you have?
Sure. So since we are owners, we actually have a right to vote our shares. And so we have a 3D diversity program that, and our ESG, environmental, social, and governance program, that we actually have our external managers adhere to, as well as our internal management. So if we don't see diversity in corporate boards, we call them on it. I mean, we've contacted Facebook, we've contacted several different businesses, as we're shareholders. And, we tell them, hey, you need more diversity. And if they say they can't find it, we're like, you're not looking in the right place. Because there are diverse people, women of color, all different ethnicities that are qualified to be on your board. So change it. The time is now.
It's great. I think that's been an underutilized lever that we have. Don, I want to go back to you because I know that you've done a lot of work in the past with the Congressional Black Caucus, and I think the expectations about what government should be doing versus corporations in which we are all customers and owners oftentimes. What Citi did a few years ago comes to mind, given the lack of governmental action around guns and gun control. The Citi decided that they were going to restrict their own credit card use for the purchase of certain firearms. And I know that Mike Corbett took a lot of heat for that, but had put a stake in the ground because he was tired of seeing people and school children being shot down. So when you think about that, what are some of the levers? I know you're trying to raise a fund for minority and women, and what are the obstacles you're overcoming, and what are the kind of power levers we can pull to kind of make that a non-event and get you more access?
Great. By the way, I applaud Citi for taking the step in the private sector to solve a social and American problem. The reality is that if we look at African Americans' position in our society, we are at the bottom of almost every measurable standard in terms of progress. And that has triggered a philanthropic outlook for African Americans. And so we need to look at this challenge and this injustice as a business and private sector responsibility. And so the private sector has to lead. I mean, African Americans, in terms of home ownership rates, at 44% today. That's lower than it was in 1968 in the epicenter of the civil rights movement. And that's compared to a 74% home ownership rate when it comes to white Americans. When you look at household net worth, African American household net worth in this country today is 17%. I mean, it's $17,000 versus $171,000 for white households. If you look at Boston, it's $8. The average household net worth for a Black Boston family is $8 versus $247,000 for white households. So that leads to poor health. That economic injustice leads to crime and public safety, and that leads to poor education. And so we as entrepreneurs, and any of us who are custodians of financial dollars, have a responsibility to right this wrong. I mean, if you look at what Byron was touching on, I'm gonna give you an example. There is 69 to 70 trillion dollars in private equity, as we talked about earlier. And by the way, less than 0.1% of real estate private equity actually goes to Black developers. We are raising this fund, as you spoke about, and I want to touch on in a second, but we're in the due diligence phase. And one of the consultants kept pressing my CFO for information on investors in our major projects in the pre-development phase. What institutional investors could they contact who invested in us in the pre-development phase? And we kept telling them no. And finally, my CFO relayed to me that the person doing the due diligence asked, wait a minute, we don't care how far back you go, but we would like to contact the institutional investors that help you get your project started. And he was told that those dollars came from retained earnings of our company and my personal dollars. And he asked our CFO why. And my CFO kind of flippantly responded, well, you see what's going on in this country right now. So African-American entrepreneurs do not have fair access to capital. Just like Byron, the growth of my company to get from $1 to $4 billion in a pipeline has been utilizing my own capital. That is an unfair system. That confronts the challenges that we have. That is a good example. And that's where the private sector can step in. In fact, the pension systems should step in. Give you an idea, New York City, the workforce of New York City government is 32% Black. It is over 60% minority, 60% female. Females and minorities combined to be over 80% of the New York City public employees workforce. Yet the pension systems that they all pay into invest less than 2% of its money with Black, minority, and women asset managers. And so there's no fair access to capital. So what the private sector needs to do here is unlock access to capital. So I know from firsthand, because I'm in a capital intensive business, that the access to capital is limited to when it comes to us. And so I got an interesting call about a year ago from Fiona Ma, the incoming treasurer of the state of California, and she asked me to consider doing an emerging developers fund. And as I looked into it, I saw how few women and minorities ever get started. And I know from all the requests that I get from those parties for capital for their deals that they're so underrepresented. And so I made a decision that we're gonna do this emerging developer fund, and I'm gonna dedicate the rest of my career to changing this access to capital. And by the way, up until about 3 weeks ago with George Floyd, I mean, we've been at this for almost a year raising capital. And look, we get proposals to invest in our big deals like our $1.6 billion downtown LA deal, but everyone's kind of shied away from our emerging developers fund because they don't see minority and women developers as a good investment, when in fact they pay more on a higher return. And again, almost everyone looking at us and then looking and investing in this fund looked at it philanthropically, or even the pension systems who are very well intended. They have an emerging or asset managers category, which is almost philanthropic in itself because it limits the size of the fund, it limits the amount of money they can put into it, and raises expectations on what the requirements are for those managers. And so everyone looks at Black developers and Black business people philanthropically when they should look at this as an emerging market. They don't need to leave the US and travel to China or the Far East or to Eastern Europe to look for opportunities, economic opportunities in emerging markets. The emerging market is right here. And it's a tremendous economic opportunity. And I'm hopeful that as we go forward as a nation, that we will see that there is a great opportunity, and this period in time will define this great transformation economically that will move our capitalistic democracy to the place that once was envisioned to go to.
Great, thank you. And Byron, let's pick up on that and go back to, I think, something that you said is so impactful, going from an asset to a liability, and that it's so ingrained systemically that nothing has been upended and changed that. So this notion of access to capital is, people tend to be defined by their otherness, and when you're not who's expected to come to be across from the banker, it's harder to get that money. I know you just recently had a suit with Comcast. Like, talk about your industry, the racism that's been so ingrained in the hardwood of that, and then what you see, hopefully optimistically, as moving towards some change.
Listen, I started my company from my dining room table 27 years ago. And I started by calling television stations, and I called all 1,300 television stations and asked them to carry my once a week, 1 hour show where I interview people talking about their latest movies. And I will keep 7 minutes of commercial time. And you, local station, you keep 7 minutes I'll keep 7 minutes of national time. You keep 7 minutes of local time. And you sell your local time to local banks, supermarkets, and car dealers. And I will sell my time to national advertisers. And, I wrote about this a little bit in my op-ed, which is at the GRIO, Black America Speaks. I didn't really have a sense of how bad it was. I called all 1,300 television stations from my dining room table from sun up to sundown. And I got about 40 or 50,000 no's to squeeze out 150 yeses to get a station in every market to carry the show so I could sell the time to an advertiser. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done. And then I had to learn to go sell the advertising myself because Tribune had decided not to sell my time as they told me they would. And that's where I had to go on the road and get to know folks. I had a guy named Roger King come to me once. And Roger King had told me, and he started King World. He sold Wheel of Fortune, Jeopardy, and Oprah, the biggest syndication company in the world. And he said, I want you to come to my office in New York. And I didn't have 2 nickels to rub together because I was trying to fund production of my show. And they were literally, my home went in and out of foreclosure probably 14 times over about a 5-year period because I was trying to pay for the tape. I was probably trying to pay the cameraman, the sound man, and the satellite. There were days I didn't eat and they turned off my phone and I was calling people from a payphone. And I would pay my mortgage every 89 days because the lady at the bank told me that on the 90th day it was going to go to a person who was much nastier than her. So I would float my mortgage. So I went and I saw Roger, and I didn't know what he wanted to talk to me about. And he said, I want you to pitch me. And I pitched him. And he said, you know what? That was great. He goes, I heard you were a great salesman. And he says, but there's only one better. He goes, that was a great pitch. He goes, but there's only one better salesman than you. And I go, who's that? And I thought he was going to say him. He said, my father. He goes, my father was the greatest salesman ever. He opened up his drawer and he pulled out a tie. And he said, this tie belonged to my dad. And he had passed away. He said, my dad loved great salesmen. He would have loved you. I want you to wear his tie. And he says, but listen up. He goes, listen, my mom and dad raised me really well. And he goes, I've been playing golf with a lot of these guys who own TV stations. And they're talking about how you call them all the time and try and sell them your television show. And he says they're laughing about the fact that you call them and how many times you call them. And they started joking and laughing about how they were never going to do business with you because you're black. And he said, my mother and father raised me better than that. He says, so I'm having my 60th birthday at my estate out at my beach house. And I've hired Elton John to perform and the Four Tops. And he goes, every guy who owns a television station is going to be in my backyard kissing my butt because they need Wheel of Fortune, Jeopardy, and Oprah. He goes, I would really like for you to be there. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I don't have the money to change my airline ticket. So I go to his beach house and I get to his gate and he's got these big guards and they go, and I'm hoping my name's there because I don't have the money to get back, right? I can't get a hotel room. And I said, Byron Allen. He goes, oh my God. He goes, the boss has been looking for you. He goes, go right in. So I go in and he screams, Byron Allen. And he walks over to me and he goes, he gives me that big old bear hug and he says, who here hasn't been returning your phone calls? I said, everybody. He goes, we're going to fix that right now. And he walked around that party and he told everybody what a great person he thought I was. And he said to one guy, I'll never forget it. He said, hey, Bob, do you want to renew Wheel of Fortune, Jeopardy, and Oprah? And obviously you have to renew those shows to keep your job. And he said, of course I do. And Roger said to him, well, he goes, I know you want to renew it. You're just trying to figure out how much I'm going to charge you. And I'm trying to figure out how much I'm going to overcharge you. He actually said, overcharge you. He goes, but while I'm trying to figure out how much I'm going to overcharge you, why don't you return Byron's call and you guys work something out, and then Byron will let me know when I can call you back to tell you what I'm charging. I never had another problem. But he was the first guy who broke the mold and said to the industry, do not discriminate against him. And he said it was a personal insult to him because my mother and father raised me better than this. What made these guys think I was cool with that? And it was interesting, and I didn't realize the issue because my mother raised me. I'm raised by a single mother. She had me 17 days after her 17th birthday. I'm born in Detroit in April of '61. I had a number of white sales executives come to me. I had 4 of them. And I said, because I would drill down, why didn't you get this done? Why didn't you sell our show to this market? And they were uncomfortable. And I kept pushing because I wanted the details. Why didn't you get it done? And 4 separate occasions, they said to me, the owner of the station said, I will never do business with you as long as you work for that inn. And they were pained. They were hurt by that. And I was conditioned to be prepared for that. I knew that. And I knew I had to comfort them. And I had to explain to them, okay, just because they called me that, it's not an excuse for us not to achieve our sales goals. Okay, that's just another reason for us to exceed them. And you have to always be honest with me and know sometimes that's going to be the situation. And you just have to work through it. But I have to tell you, I appreciate them telling you that and telling you why. Because there are plenty of times they'll never say it. You had a breakthrough with them. And I think it's important that people know that it's real, that it's systemic, it's throughout the system, and that it's planned that way. And I will take the position, we can never say, okay, do it because all of a sudden you shouldn't have a problem with me. I'll just tell you the truth. You have to look at the math. When we're 330 million people out of a global population of about 8 billion. We're less than 5% of the global population. Half the women in this country are living at or below the poverty line. Half. If the women fail, if the mothers fail, so will the children. I have succeeded because my mother went to UCLA and got her master's degree in cinema TV production. And while she was at UCLA getting her master's degree, she has a little boy that she takes to NBC as an intern. And this little boy is watching Johnny Carson and Bob Hope and Flip Wilson. And that exposure for me showed me a better life. And I said, I'm going to be like them. That's you great. Need that exposure. And because she had because she got into UCLA, changed our lives forever. She was pregnant at 16 with me. Education changed the game. So when you look at the women failing, that's not an option. And when you look at something like China, China has 200 million kids in college mastering STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And we all know that the capital will always end up in the hands of the people who have the intellectual capital. And we, as Americans, as an American tribe, are not developing enough intellectual capital to compete with the rest of the world. We can no longer say black or white. It has to be one tribe, the American tribe.
I know we're running out of time, and I do want to kind of get to some more tactical things we can tell people. So let me start with you, Phil. We talk a lot about the health disparities, and food deserts are a contributor to that, but there's also what we would think of as broadband deserts, and people don't have access to even Wi-Fi, and there's banking deserts, and people don't have access to financing or capital. What are we gonna do about it? I think I would like to go to all 4 of you just for some last thoughts as we're wrapping up here. What do you want to tell white people that they can do to kind of help and be an ally in a way that, to both Byron and Don's point, doesn't feel like philanthropy and create that power dynamic, but what can you really do to be an active catalyst towards change?
I think, Richard, it's what I would tell all people, which is America responded and changed its behavior in profound and fundamental ways to tackle a new virus, COVID-19. We did things that I would have said were impossible to have the majority of Americans do. Stay home, shut down Broadway, wear masks outside. That was something other people did. We did that. What I would say is we should look at racism as a virus, the same way that we looked at COVID-19. Put the same intellectual firepower and resources into understanding where it comes from, how is it spread, who can pass it to whom, how does it manifest, asymptomatic to severely symptomatic, who's vulnerable to catching it, who's most vulnerable to the adverse effects, and then how do you go about fixing it? I dare hope that we can understand it. Don't look at it as bad people and good people. Look at it as a virus that we do have the intellectual capacity to figure out and understand, and we've shown that we have the motivation and the determination to change behavior. If we apply the same approach that we applied to COVID-19, I think we have a chance of ridding ourselves of this virus also.
That's a great way to look at it. Thank you. Deborah, any last thoughts on it?
Yes, thank you. So we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion, and we just need to move beyond diversity and talk about inclusion. So if your C-suite thinks diversity and inclusion is important, that's policy. If your staff thinks that it's important, that's your culture. So we need to move beyond the conversations that we've been conditioned to avoid. We need to have real talk. Our personal experiences are brought to work. Let's talk about them. I also want to say, for your Black colleagues, and I'm talking about the CEOs and the leaders of the organization, don't ask us to represent your empathy. It's your turn. We've toiled and toiled and toiled. We're tired. It's your turn, and the time is now.
That's great. Thank you. Don?
Well, I do, by the way, agree. It is our time. I think this is a time that the business community does need to step up. But I think Americans are challenging our system. More and more Americans, if we all look on TV and we see the protest and what the protesters look like, and they're diverse. In many instances, there will be more white protesters than there are African-American protesters, and they're protesting all over the country, in major cities and in smaller cities as well. And what that is telling us is that these people, these young people who are out here protesting, and all are seeing what many of us know, that this is an unfair system. And hopefully we're all going to understand what exactly the message in Black Lives Matters. What does it really mean? It doesn't mean just the police not killing Black people. It means equal protection under the law, equal treatment under the law. And it means that Black dreams matter. It means that Black ambition matters. It means that Black education matters. It means that Black healthcare matters. It means that Black entrepreneurship matters. And so what we can take away from this is that we as Americans all benefit from a fair system. And we as Americans, be us, any gender, race, we all benefit by fairness. And we now know that this system is unfair, and its unfairness is expanding. I mean, the gay community experiences tremendous discrimination. Women have confronted tremendous discrimination and harassment and abuse. And African Americans, we've suffered a long, long time in this country. So we can level, as business people, level the playing field, level the opportunities, and provide opportunities to people reflective of the demographics of our country and the communities that we believe in. That requires an aggressive, affirmative steps to level that playing field, and so when all of us do business, that we do business in a profitable, productive way, but aggressive steps for affirmative inclusion. Our company does that, for example, that we have had a goal, which we've exceeded for the last 30 some odd years, of 25% of all of our contracts to go to minority and women-owned businesses. Now that goal is 35%. And so we all say we're gonna make an effort as we do business to do business and provide opportunities reflective of the demographics of the communities that we do business in. We will have a very fair system. And that is what I would leave anyone listening today and watching this today with that message. Let's just level the playing field. Let's treat everybody the same. Let's give everybody the same benefit of the doubt and the same breaks and the same expectations.
That's great. I think too often people have given themselves accolades for trying, and they're allergic to metrics or accountability. So that's a good point. Byron, let's wrap with you. 1 minute.
Absolutely, easy enough. You know, listen, I wrote about it, like I said, Black America Speaks, America Should Listen. It's at thegrio.com. Real simple. One word: invest, invest, invest. You know, we love people like Michael Jordan. Why is Michael Jordan great? Because he always worked on his deficit. He eliminated his weaknesses and made sure he had nothing but strength. That is the very definition of greatness. We must invest. You know, I go vacation every year in Maui, and there's the same families kind of show up at the same time. And, you know, you become very friendly. And there's a lady who I became very friendly with. And we started talking because her husband had markings on his arms because he was a Holocaust victim. He was in the concentration camps. And we started talking. And over the years, we got to know each other. And I'll never forget, one year she said to me, you know, I almost didn't make it back here to the cabana to hang out with you, Byron. And I said, why is that? She says, well, I had a heart problem and nobody wanted to operate on this little old lady. And nobody wanted to open me up. No one wanted to take that exposure. And I said, what happened? She said, well, my son said to me, well, why don't you call Mike? And she said, little Mikey, who lived a couple of doors down, that I would make cookies and milk for. And her son said, yeah, but he's not so little anymore, Mom. Now he's a leading cardiologist, heart surgeon. Just call him and let him know what's going on. So she calls him up and she says, hey, little Mikey, do you remember me? It's Mrs. Weissman. I used to make cookies and milk for you. He goes, of course I remember you. She says, I don't want to bother you. My son said to call you, but I have this heart problem and no one wants to open me up. And he goes, well, listen, why don't you immediately email me your records? And she said, okay. And she emailed the records and he called back like an hour later and said, get on the next plane smoking and come see me. I'm going to operate on you tomorrow. And he did. And he saved her life and added years to her life. And right there, I had that epiphany. That child that we're letting just go to the wayside, that child is what we need to invest in to save ourselves. It was right there I realized how important it is for us to invest and not incarcerate, for us to position every American to live up to their fullest potential. That is what we have to do. This is for the sake of saving America. We must invest. That's the thing I would ask everybody to really lean back and do. Lean in and invest in each and every American. Equally invest.
Well, thank you. I know we're out of time, and this is obviously a very robust topic and one that we will continue to discuss and amplify here at the Institute through all of our sessions. I want to thank all of our speakers, thank all of you for joining, and look forward to continuing this dialogue. Thank you.